Good evening, welcome, I'm Josh Carpenter. Tonight I'm here to talk to you about low frequency sound and cognitive performance. Before I get started, I like to start off with a quote before I do anything. It just reminds me of why we're here and gives us a little bit to think about before I get on with it. It says, "Music is the movement of sound to reach the soul for the education of its virtue." And that is by Plato. And it really speaks to kind of the project that I created out of this thesis, and kind of the aspect I was looking to reach was with the inner child, the soul, the part that needs to be calmed. So the area of focus, the children that I worked with during this time were children who had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Right now it is the most common disability in the U.S. It can be targeted through cognitive training. And what that means is there are so many interventions out there right now. One particular intervention that they're starting to use for this deficit is called cognitive computer training. Some of you may have heard of a program called Lumosity. Lumosity is a commercial program that targets cognitive performance. And through that program, students or adults are able to boost their cognition through different repetitive games. However, because these children do have ADHD, just getting them to focus on the cognitive training was in itself very, very difficult. So my aim for this was to find a way to calm them down and help them focus. So the purpose of the study was to see if low frequency sound could help improve the task attention of students who have this deficit with attention. And I do want to say deficit with attention because some of the students that we'll talk about later don't necessarily have a diagnosis of ADHD, but they have a diagnosis in which their disability affects their attention to task. So because not all students can get that diagnosis from their doctor of, hey, you have ADHD, a lot of times it's us, the educational professionals, to give them a code. In California, one of those codes is specific learning disability due to deficits in attention, and that's for these students who don't have that formal diagnosis. So the other purpose is to find an inexpensive environmental sound that can provide an enriched learning environment, meaning something cheap that the teacher could do to help focus their students without going out and spending a lot of money, without getting very complicated in their intervention. Just simply an environmental change that causes effect. My research questions were the following. Will filling a room with low frequency sound help improve the task attention in students with specific deficits in attention? And two, does low frequency sound affect other cognitive functions? And the reason that this second part is there is because Lumosity doesn't just look at attention. It looks at things such as speed, problem solving, and flexibility. So we're going to look at the scores of that as well, not just the attention piece. I'd like to do a brief review of the literature so we can understand kind of where all this came from and the great people who have studied it before I did. Attention deficit disorder is obviously one of the most plaguing and most used codings that we have these days, kind of an epidemic that's swept across our nation in the last 10 years. The symptoms are, of course, no focusing, hyperactivity, not being able to control behavior. It really affects the working memory, which is that frontal cortex piece that really drives us to be able to control our emotions, to pay attention to things, to have that ability. Now, the working memory can be strengthened. We know that through cognitive training, we can strengthen those parts of the body, or the mind. The way cognitive training looks is it actually is like games. It's very simple games that even children can be sort of enticed by. And they target these specific areas of cognition: memory, speed, flexibility, and attention. One study, the one that I found the most impressive, was they put cognitive training in a double-blind test against a medication. And the results of those studies were phenomenal. The cognitive training was equal to that of the medications, meaning the children who were just doing this cognitive training were able to pay attention just as well as the students who were on heavy ADHD medication, which we all know is the form of a stimulant and a very psychoactive drug. So it's kind of phenomenal that a computer program can train a student's brain to do the same thing that we would just like to throw medication at and have that same problem fixed. My suggestion, and the one thing I couldn't find in this research, was focusing on the training conditions, which means the environment that the students are training in, because from what I've found, that has a big deal. So I think that these guys agreed with me. This was the one study I could find that said, yeah, we need to look at this area. And that was kind of my motivation for creating this study. So what is environmental noise? So that one of the environmental distractors that we can find in any classroom is noise. Well, what is noise? Noise is defined as any sound that is not wanted. So any sound can be noise if it's not wanted to the person who's hearing it. In a classroom, that means any sound that's going to stop that child from learning. Any sound that's going to stop that child from paying attention to the lessons. Noise these noise distractions, what we found is that can be masked by other sounds, such as white noise. And those sounds actually help those students who would normally be distracted by such noises to focus by sort of acting as their executive functioning and blocking out all of the other sounds so that they can focus on their task at hand. Low frequency sound. So this is where the intervention part comes in. Sound is a vibration. That's what sound is. The speed or frequency is measured in hertz. And that's what tells us whether a frequency is high or low. The human ear can pick up frequencies ranging from 20 hertz, which is very, very low, to 2,000 hertz, which is very, very high. It is the highest point before we cannot hear. Dogs, for example, hear above that 20,000 hertz level. Through research, we also know that frequencies of sound between 20 hertz and 60 hertz, that's sounds that are not heard. Those are the sounds that you hear when you are driving down the road and somebody else comes up to you with a very loud car speaker and your car starts to shake from the other car that's listening to their music. That shaking, that vibration, those are the low frequency sounds. We call that, in layman's terms, bass. So as I go on through this presentation and I'm talking about low frequency sound, you can know that I'm talking about bass from a subwoofer, which you can actually see right here. I have in my classroom. Clearly I'm a fan. So these noises are felt by the body. This has been studied since the 90s and is commonly used today in the medical and educational fields. It's transmitted through transducers, which I just showed you. It's a subwoofer. We have these fancy names, low frequency transducer. It is nothing more than a subwoofer which is playing bass throughout the room. The uses of it are very, very interesting. There are three major uses that we have found that have been proven so far with this vibroacoustic therapy. Vibroacoustic therapy is just the term for using bass and a subwoofer to produce therapeutic effects. So the therapeutic effects that have been proven so far, before I started to study this, long before, the first one is relaxation. So our heart rate calms down when we are exposed to these frequencies. Where our blood circulation starts to flow and we reduces our muscle tension. The second thing is inhibition of pain. So what happens when a muscle that is sore or a joint that is sore is exposed to this frequency is that the tissues around it are able to it stimulates them, but that actually what's causing them is to kind of, what's the word, kind of to de-inflate, to relax. And what that does is it blocks the signal from the muscle to the brain so that the patient can no longer hear it. And that's one interesting thing that I will say about this low frequency sound is that it is the only force in the world that passes through us. So wind, of course, is a force that passes around us. Sound actually passes through us. And not only does it pass through us, but it passes through us at the cellular level. So it is physically going through our cells. And the byproduct of that, what is found, is to be cellular cleansing. That we're actually getting rid of molecular waste when we are exposed to these low frequency sounds. So these are the medical uses, and these are already used today throughout the medical field. Pretty powerful stuff when we're thinking about the simplicity of a subwoofer and bass, something that has been around for a long, long time. So my methodology. My preparation for this experiment was I had the subwoofer and a low frequency generator. The low frequency generator was just a program that I purchased on the iPad, which allowed me to play low frequencies through my subwoofer. The condition of the room that these guys came into was an empty room. It was a individual activity that they came to do their training on a daily basis. So upon the arrival, the students would enter one by one. Now this was a middle school. Kids would come in whenever they could get there. So it wasn't necessarily everyone sitting in a single file line and they come in and sit down and they start their training and we push on a timer and then we stop the training and then they leave. It was more open. And what that means is there was actually more distractions than you would typically find in an instructional environment because the kids would come in 5 minutes, 2 minutes later than one another. Then they would start their training. And what they would do is they would sit at a computer in a U shape. The subwoofer was in the middle of that U shape. Once the participants began the training, I started to collect data. When they finished their training, they exited the room, and then once they were all finished, I was able to collaborate the data. What kind of data? So, on-task behavior. Because the students, and what I'm talking about in current condition is what my students were like, their present levels of performance for those of us who are in the business. Their on-task behavior was low. Their training in the cognition program was lowering because of their inability to pay attention. So that was a huge problem. That was the problem that kind of opened up my ears to this sort of intervention. And what else I realized is that the environmental noises, people coming in, and this is in California, so we always had windows open and it was nice weather. It's a little different out here. So there was noises coming from everywhere. So my implementation was to play this low frequency sound through my subwoofer. The participants were all from a lower income neighborhood at a charter school in San Diego, California. They all had IEPs. They were all IEPs that were directed around lack of attention. The grades ranged from 5 to 8. I had 4 5th graders, 1 7th grader, and 1 8th grader. And they were all enrolled in the cognition program. So, the intervention. I played the sound. This was a specific frequency. It was 52. And what that means is it pulsates between 50 and 60 beats per minute. An interesting thing is that this is also the rate of a calm human heart. So I'm literally playing a bass of a frequency that is the same as a calm human heart, so that their hearts would calm down to the same level as the low frequency sound. We had 2 weeks without the intervention. That was when I collected my baseline data. That was one of the areas of where I found that red flag was, okay, we really need to do something here. Then we had 6 weeks with the intervention, and this was the last 6 weeks that I was in California, the last 6 weeks of school, so we had a lot to do in a little bit of time. Lumosity was their training program. They are literally just little games that help you focus. And then at the end, it gives a numeric score for each of those areas. So you get a score for memory, you get a score for flexibility, problem solving, and attention. For my instrumentation, I both took quantitative and qualitative data. The quantitative data was, of course, the numeric scores that we found through Lumosity, and I also took interval time sampling of just their on-task and off-task behavior, which means every minute I looked up to see if they were either A, on-task, or B, off-task. I marked it, and we went on to the next minute, something we do very much here at Carl Sandburg. The qualitative data was the things that I observed. So I took notes the whole time of the distractions, for example, the types of distractions. And that's where I found categorical data, with the types of distractions that both were found before the intervention and how much was noticed after or during the intervention. For data analysis, I used Excel. I put all the information in, popped out some great graphs and some good averages, and I even put in some trend lines just to see if we were to continue, where would this go. And then the observational and anecdotal data I made into categories so that we could see visually which decreased during this time. The ethical considerations, no harm was going to come to any of these students. I talked to each of the students beforehand individually about their safety, about what they would be hearing, about what they would be feeling. And I told them if it was bothersome, they could always exit the building. They did not have to stay if there was some reason that they could hear the sound or the sound was bothersome to them in any way. However, through research, I knew that the sound was not dangerous to them. And I will point out that there are dangerous sounds. Once we get below that 20 hertz level, we have infrared sound, and that's actually something that's more dangerous to the human body, and actually is being used as weapons in the military. There is a whole militarization going on of using sound as a weapon. And at the same time, sounds that are too high can also be dangerous. So I made sure to not only use a low frequency, but something that was safe for the children to use. The bias, the luminosity data is taken by a computer, so there's no bias there. There's no way for the computer to analyze what the student's doing. It just spits out numbers. And then for myself, I made clear definitions of off-task behavior so that I wasn't just randomly saying the student was on and off-task. The limitations were there. This was a very small class. This was 6 students in one resource room, in one charter school, one special education class, very, very small pool. The time constraints were also an issue. I only had 8 weeks, so 2 weeks baseline, 6 weeks did not give me a long time to analyze the data, but I got to look at the trend lines, which kind of gave me a further aspect of where the data was going. The variations of frequency study, I only used one frequency, and that's 52 hertz. So as you can imagine, there are lots of frequencies in between 2 and 200 to study. I chose one, and that was in the middle of those 50 to 60 BPMs, which I felt was important to keep it around the calm human heart rate. And then the acoustics. So that was something that I didn't perceive until I was actually walking around taking the data. And what happens is every room has acoustics. It just means the way that sound bounces off of different objects in the room. And what I found was, although you couldn't hear the sound through the majority of the room, there were pockets where there was what we call reverberation. And it was almost like you could feel it in your ears. And it would have been really distracting if I was a teacher. And I was a teacher, but if I was giving the instruction and I was trying to do explicit instruction, not only would this be distracting to me, but if there were students located in those pockets, it would have been very distracting to them. So it wasn't necessarily looking at the whole, because my group was small and in one place. And it was that place was tested to make sure that there were none of these pockets of reverberation. So acoustics are a limitation because they do differ from room to room. We could play the same sound in this room and it would be completely different than the sound that I played in that room. And that's just because of the way that sound bounces off of objects. Here's the good stuff. The data. What happened? Student A. So there were 6 students. I'm going to go through them one by one so we can get a look at what happened. At the end I'll talk about, when I summarize everything up, kind of the whole. But I want to look at the individual students since there were only 6. The first thing we're going to look at is the cognitive scores. We have problem solving, speed, flexibility, memory, attention. You can see what we're looking at, is the red is the intervention and the blue is the baseline. So here we had drops in problem solving and memory. However, we did have gains in speed, flexibility, and attention. They weren't huge gains, but they were gains. The on-task behavior, we did have a downtrending line. And actually the lines were trending up before the intervention. However, when looking at the total progress made, this student was on task only 66.5% of the time before the intervention. While being exposed to the low frequency sound, the student was on task 79.3%. That is a huge increase. And we're going to see that trend as we go through these numbers. Student B also had drops in their cognitive scores in problem solving and for them speed. However, they did have gains in flexibility, memory, and attention. Again, a trend we're going to see throughout the results. On-task behavior, again, we're seeing a downward trend by the end of the intervention. But again, here we have a huge, significant increase. This student was on task 55.7% of the time before the intervention. While being exposed, they were on task 76% of the time. That's an over 20% increase in their task attention. Actually, I'm going to go back really quick because I want to say one thing about students A and B, and this was interesting. Students A and B both had the lowest gains in this area, or for this whole project. These two students were also the furthest students from the subwoofer. So these two students felt less of what the other students felt. Because the closer you are to the subwoofer, the more you feel it. So the two, and since we were in a U, we had two students very close, two students a little further away, and then our A and B students who are way out here on the ends. Student C, we only had drops in problem solving, and actually this is one of the other areas we'll see as we're going through that this was a trend. But they had gains in speed, flexibility, memory, and attention. When we look, this guy was already on task pretty well. I mean, 81.6% at baseline. I couldn't ask for more than that as a teacher. That's a great number. However, when exposed, he was able to do it 98.2%. So as a teacher, I could say absolutely I would love that increase because now we're going from something that's standard to something that's exceeding the standards. And his trend lines by the end were moving up. So there's no telling how, I mean, you can only go up 0.8 more percent. But what we're seeing is that it was working and it was advancing. For student D, we had no drops. His flexibility stayed stagnant. Nothing changed. He had gains in problem solving, speed, memory, and attention. His on-task behavior did not drop. The trend line was going up before the intervention, which is this red line, but during the intervention, the trend line is going way up. He was on task 67.3% of the time before the intervention. While exposed, he boosted that to 83.6%. Again, almost a 20% gain in his task attention while being exposed to this low frequency sound. Student E had drops in problem solving, something that we saw from a lot of our students, but gains in all of the other areas, including attention, which we saw from all the other students. He had 0 drops. And in fact, if we can see before the intervention, his trend lines were going down. He was getting worse. Now, worse wasn't that bad when considering his on-task was already at 82.4%. However, while being exposed, he did not come off task one time. 100% task attention while being exposed to the low frequency sound. And I will say student E and student F, which we're about to look at, were the closest ones to the subwoofer, and thus showing the most gains. We again had some drops in problem solving for student F, but gains in speed, flexibility, memory, and attention. He was already on task 88.5% of the time, but while being exposed, he was able to boost that to 95.8%. That is a huge difference when we're talking about task attention. So my categorical data. So this was the types of behaviors, off-task behaviors that we saw. Auditory behaviors. So that means talking, singing, tapping, humming, anything that created sound. And again, these are the off-task behaviors that the students were doing. Before, we had 55 times when the students as a whole made auditory behaviors or auditory off-task behaviors. During, that number dropped to 27 times. So again, we're seeing almost a 50% decrease, over 50% decrease in the types of auditory behaviors that we were seeing during the training. Next, I tracked physical off-task behaviors, meaning rocking, tapping, touching, these simple things that we see our students with disabilities having a trouble controlling. Before, there were 22 instances where they were doing these physical off-task behaviors. During, only 10. Next was visual. Were they looking around? Were they spying on their neighbor's computer? Were they just looking up into space? 11 times that happened before the intervention. During, 4.7 times. And I would like to point out that all of these before times are 2 weeks of time. So when we're talking 55 times in 2 weeks versus 27 times in 6 weeks, 22 times in 2 weeks versus 10 times in 6 weeks, 11 times in 2 weeks, 4.7 times in 6 weeks. So even though the numbers aren't that far off from each other, when we're thinking about that time frame, that is a huge decrease in all of these behaviors. And these are all behaviors that are seen throughout classrooms with any kid who has attention deficits or just problems with attention, period. My final thoughts. This study I created this study to find a low-cost intervention that could be used in the environment for students with attention deficit disorder. The data yielded data that showed that these low-frequency sounds can be used as a really positive intervention for these kids. An intervention that could help them with other interventions. Because quite honestly, that is exactly what they did here. And the class as a whole flourished. All of my numbers show that this was an effective tool that we could use to intervene with these kids' task attention. Now, I will say, it does have to be to the confines, at least within my study, the data shows it has to be within the confines of an independent activity. None of these kids were involved in group activities, they weren't involved in direct instruction, it was an independently focused activity. However, when we think about our students and how that could be used in the future, all of our students have accommodations on state testing. All state testing is individual, it's an individual activity. So my recommendation through all of this data would be, let's try and make this an accommodation for students so that they can have a better chance at focusing on those really hard tasks that are independent for them. Which for students with deficits in attention, that can be the hardest thing to do, is an independent activity, especially one with high stress levels. Providing such a low frequency accommodation would not only decrease the stress levels, but they would allow them to pay attention to the task at hand. These are my references. Have fun with a microscope. I got some in the classroom if you'd like to look at those. And this is the part where I open up to the panel for questions. Ms. Kenny, do you have any questions?
I do, actually. I'm curious to know, when you had the students do this independently, were the students then, after the intervention was over, were they able, and I know you said it was right at the end of the school year, so it's possible they didn't, but were they able to notice that this assisted them even in having that cognitive training and then taking it to another environment, another classroom or something else?
I don't know about those specific students, and it was because of the time,
right.
The time lapse. Literally, after the day 30 hit, I was out the door. So I didn't get a chance to follow up on those students, nor was I able to sort of maybe suggest to the other teachers that they were able to use this.
I have another question about the drops where it indicated that there were 5 individuals that had a drop in problem solving.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
That's a great question, and I've thought a lot about this. And my assumption would be that problem solving is a very cognitively complicated process. You're using both sides of your brain. So it could be that sound is affecting the different parts of the brain differently. And I would actually suggest, if it were possible, that each student have their own subwoofer by them. And I think that because the further you got out, like I mentioned before, the further the sound got away. So it wasn't necessarily individualized to that student, but I feel like if we had headphones, there are headphones that play these low frequencies, by the way, that we would have more of a positive impact on the individual students' abilities. In fact, but I think in the environment, there was something that was keeping them or impeding them from making progress with problem solving.
Is it possible that Luminosity, the program that you were utilizing, the problem solving part of the program was capturing like maybe something that had to do with the actual, I don't know, the sound itself? I mean, is it possible that there was some kind of connection there where it could possibly cause it to drop, or it's just that's too much to even kind of take under as a system?
No. I don't think that that's possible just because it's a computer program. It's a computer. It's not necessarily affected by the sound.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have a question about the validity of Lumosity's
that's where
data.
heading.
There are several articles out there where you can find that say the opposite, that Lumosity doesn't do this and it doesn't do that. There were a lot more studies that showed that cognitive training is effective. But there was nothing specifically about the individual areas that Lumosity looked at and how. I could not find any information on how they got those scales and what those numbers represented.
Okay.
And I will say that those numbers it was a progressive number. So there might have been days where that number didn't change. But that's because there were days when that student didn't work on that specific skill.
Okay.
So that was the other part. The third thing I will say is that some of these tasks were a bit above the student's level. So they does require basic addition and subtraction. And one of the activities, you have to add numbers in your head quickly and write the answer. So I did have a few students who just sat there during that part because they didn't have the prerequisite skills in order to add that fast. Or there's another one where you have to spell. So the spelling and the math one, those two activities alone, a lot of my students, even if they could get basic parts of it, weren't fluid with it. And the program is designed for people who are fluid with it, because you're boosting on your skills that are already there. Because these students lack skills in certain areas, which I would guarantee problem solving would be on the top of that list, they weren't quite there yet. So I think that might have had an impact on the cognitive scores.
Right.
And that's, yes.
I was going to ask about didn't the problems increase in difficulty with the time? Wouldn't that be the idea that they start with simpler problems and then work their way up?
Absolutely.
So,
and that is how it worked. But when you're at like 1 + 1, and the kid, there's nowhere simpler for them to go. So if you're not making the increase, they're not going to increase it. It's going to stay stagnant, which is one of the students we saw, his area stayed stagnant because he didn't make any increases or decreases in that, which means he was doing the same thing every time and not doing anything different. And that's why I actually feel like the on and off task data in this experiment was much more valid and much more eye-opening to me, because it was within my control. I was taking that data, so I know how it was calculated, and those numbers that we saw were phenomenal. Those changes in on-task and off-task behavior were undeniable. They were significant changes.
I just wondered, Josh, did the students know when you started the sound in the first week of it? When you did you say to them, you're starting to sound now, or did they just not know that?
No, they did know it. And then that was like part of the ethical considerations, is that I wanted to make sure that they knew what was going on, so that if something weird happened to them internally or auditorily, that they would know what was happening. I mean, I also got them familiar with it. I showed them the subwoofer. We played, I played music on it so we could see what it does. I didn't want it to be sort of, I don't know what's going on, why is this happening to me kind of a thing.
Yeah, the only thing is that could also be a limitation of the study a little bit.
Sure.
Because once you tell somebody you're in a study, we're doing this to you, they can act differently than they would because they know that they're participating in the study.
Okay, I didn't tell them about the study aspect. I told them what was happening as though I'm going to start doing this cool thing.
What it was supposed to do or anything?
No, I did not go over any of that. So again, I wanted to avoid that bias part of it. That no, they didn't know they were part of a study. All they knew is that Mr. Carpenter was doing something weird again, and he was walking around taking data like he always does. So it wasn't really a different situation for them. I just explained to them what the weird thing I was doing this time was.
So your idea that the cognitive training, which is equal to the medication from ADHD, if you could then, and maybe this is going a little too far out there, but if the student were to realize that this type of low frequency sound assisted in that they would be able to use it outside of that,
Absolutely.
so that the cognitive training that they're taking part in would still strengthen them later, even if they didn't have the low frequency sound.
Yeah, I think that, I guess that would be the goal.
I mean, if you're able to strengthen it the way...
Yeah, then you would eventually not need the sound, absolutely, because you're strengthening your task attention. So essentially, eventually, you would not need the low frequency sound. Now, it can still be used for other purposes, like the calming aspect, or the pain relieving aspect.
But the other great thing is, like, for student study teams and things, when you're meeting with parents, is to say, when your child's working at home, you might try these headphones with this program, this low frequency sound, because it's proven that it will make them stay on task better. They'll focus more, I think it would be really advantageous, or a teacher in a classroom that's having difficulty even with a few students focusing, say, hey, why don't you put these headphones on? And, and see.
Absolutely. And there's also actually like chairs that you can get where there's a pad in the back, and then they have the subwoofers in the pad, so that it can go through so you can sit on it individually and go. Like, of course, they cost hundreds of dollars, and I wasn't going to do this as a low-cost intervention for anybody, but it is possible. They are out there to where you just literally sit on this thing, and it pushes the frequencies through your body. So there are individualized kind of ways that we could present this to parents. The headphone, I think, is the cheapest way. And YouTube right now, you can find these vibroacoustic therapy recordings on YouTube. So, and they're actually combined usually with visuals as well. So even from just the calming aspect, it could be something that we teach children how to self-calm.
I'm curious how you even came to this. Like,
Wow.
what made you get to the point where you started to think, like, this is impacting my students or could impact my students?
That's a great question. I grew up in a bass-driven music. I grew up listening to electronic dance music, and it is bass-driven. And so I was always fascinated by bass and what it did. When I was 16, I would put subwoofers in my closet and go in there and turn on the music because I liked the feeling. And I didn't know why. And once I got into grad school and I sort of started to come up with an idea of how could I help my students, and it just sort of hit me one day is, why would I like this? Maybe my students would like that. And the second I typed in bass and autism into Google, all these studies came out, and I was like, wow, this is probably one of the most fascinating things I've ever read, and right up my alley, because I'm already, my mind was already there. So it was sort of random life experiences all culminating into one at one time, kind of one aha moment.
That's really interesting that you came to that. Would you ever think of like replicating this type of a study just to see how it works on children who are younger in age, or maybe have something beyond just a learning disability?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, in fact, from the research that I've gathered, it's more beneficial for people with more emotional and emotional related disabilities because of that calming aspect. Because you can put it on and it will instantly put your heartbeat down. It's like a physiological reaction that your heart has to the sound. And the same thing happens to us when we go to a concert. Our heartbeats automatically adjust to the beat of the music. It's just we're tuned that way. So that, I don't know if that answers your question.
And then there's no correlation between like the cognitive functioning of an individual and the reaction from the heart. It would be the same regardless of whether you're testing at an IQ of 34 versus, you know, you have an IQ of 134. Would there be? I wouldn't think there would be because it's physiological.
Yeah, I agree. And what we're learning about the heart and the brain are actually very connected right now. I've just read a very interesting study that talked about that our heart actually does send emotional signals to our brain. So in that aspect, I think it would be extremely beneficial.
I would love to know, and I would love to know if there would be any way to impact students who have PANDAS with that gastrointestinal issue, simply because there is some thought and research about the gut having some more connection to the brain and to the heart. And so if you have that, because that's not a well understood disorder. And so I'm wondering like how that could possibly tie into something like this. Like, could it actually relax the body enough that some of those gastrointestinal problems that a lot of our students suffer from,
Absolutely.
if that could kind of alleviate some of their suffering.
I like that. I think that.
Josh could do all those studies when he does his doctorate.
Yes, yes.
You know it's coming. Yeah, no, I think that's a phenomenal way to go with this study, and looking at those aspects of how, because you're right. The more research that comes out, the more we realize how connected our brain and our body are. That we're not just these empty vessels. That our whole system communicates with one another. And so, if we can affect pain by base, I don't see why we couldn't affect gastroesophageal refluxes or whatever problem they're having internally.
Right. Well, I feel like I'm going to have like a million more questions. Those were like the primary ones on the top of my head, but I would be really interested to see kind of how this plays out. I think the testing aspect, I don't know, this really isn't a question, but more of a comment. I think the testing aspect is interesting for a lot of our kids because it's that individual activity. I'd like to see how it works with little tiny people, and I'd like to see how it works with more of a, like in a group setting, when like a typical teacher would be teaching a class of however many. And I just think that that would be kind of interesting. Having taught high school, I think about my 17, 18-year-old who listen to music that is, it's kind of like jaw-jarring, you know, and I'm wondering like why that's so attractive to them. And now that you've brought this up, I'm wondering if that has something to do with it as well.
Absolutely.
So I think that there's just so many different areas that you could go with this.
Yeah.
And I would hope that at some point you would be willing to present this to our staff, and even outside of our staff, if that's something you're allowed to do. I don't know all the ramifications of everything, but
Sure, it's fine, right, Posey?
I just think that there's opportunities to present to the administration and supervision staff throughout the school year, and I think that this is something that would be of great interest to many staff members throughout Montgomery County.
Oh, that would be a pleasure and an honor. Excellent.
Okay.
Well, good, Josh. That was great. You did perfect. So